Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the Society for Clinical Research site. For today's Good Business Practices webinar, today's presentation is Best Practices for Managing Regulatory Binders Electronically. And our presenters today are Tricia Locke from Keystone Research and Bree Burks from Viva. For more information on all our webinars and all of our member benefits for being a member of the Society, please visit us at myscrs.org and browse to the Members Only tab. Immediately following today's webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey. In order for you to successfully receive your contact hour credit for today's presentation, you must be logged into WebEx as an individual, remain present for the webinar in its entirety, and complete the post-webinar survey. If these three requirements are met, you will receive a contact hour certificate via email within 30 days. There is no contact hour credit offered for listening to the recording of this presentation. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature that's found at the bottom right of your WebEx window. This webinar will continue for approximately 1 hour, and I'm glad to turn it over to our presenters today.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for giving us your time. We truly appreciate it. I'm Bree Burks. I am at Viva Systems. I'm the Vice President of Strategy for Site Solutions. So that means I wake up and think about building technology for research sites every day. I've worked in sites throughout my career, most recently at Vanderbilt, where I ran a central clinical trials office there. And so thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to sharing some best practices with you today.
And hi, everyone. I'm Tricia Locke, and I'm currently the CEO and Director of Research for Keystone Research. We're a high-volume ophthalmology clinical research site. But I kind of took the opposite route of Bree and was in the sponsor side of the industry for about 20 years. As a consultant, working as a global project manager and early on in my career, a CRA in many therapeutic areas. And I'm really passionate about technology and the efficiencies it can bring to help us at the sites to provide quality and assurances to the sponsors.
Great. So we're going to quickly review our agenda here. We're going to first look at industry drivers for change and benefits of implementing an e-regulatory solution. Moving from that, tips to choosing the right system and evaluating a vendor, looking at best practices and then things to avoid when you do choose to go electronic. And then we will open up a Q&A at the end. So just to note, please save your questions or go ahead and send your questions along as they come up, and we will wait until the end of the webinar to review those questions with you. So, industry drivers for change and benefits of an e-regulatory system. This is your opportunity to help guide us and really help us sort of tailor the content moving forward to where the majority of you are at today. So we're going to start a poll, and we'd like to hear from you how you are currently storing and managing regulatory documents. You can select all that apply here. Are you using paper or a share drive, SharePoint, flash drives? So for that example, your files are electronic, but it's not a purpose-built system for clinical trials. Are you actually, third option, using a purpose-built system like an e-regulatory solution or an EISF system? You might hear it referred to as that as well. Are you going into sponsor portals such as SIF and providing your documents? Oftentimes here, this is going to be specific to certain sponsors you're working with, or maybe only on a study-by-study basis. So this is not technology you selected. This is technology that the sponsor has offered to you. Is there something else that you're doing that we haven't categorized, or are you not a site and this isn't applicable to you? So if you could select what applies and submit it to us, we will review those results with you here shortly. All right, here we go. So it looks like a lot of people didn't answer, but of those that did answer, 20 of you are managing on paper, 11 in some sort of a shared drive. So your files are electronic, but they probably originated in paper, or you're not using a system that's necessarily Part 11 compliant or purpose-built for regulatory. And then 9 of you, so 11% on the phone, are actually using an e-regulatory system. So that's great. Thank you so much. That truly helps us determine how to kind of tailor content moving forward and make sure we really focus in on how to get started with this for those of you that are still on paper, not in a purpose-built system, which seems to be the majority here. So landscape is changing. Many of you probably know this, and that might be why you're joining today. You are in the throes of experiencing what we're showing here on this slide. The number of trials is continuing to increase over time. Probably good job security for a lot of us on the phone. However, that also is coming with additional complexity of those studies. As we are venturing into personalized medicine and rare disease, our inclusion-exclusion criteria is getting much, much more complex. The level of data we're collecting is getting more complex, and in order to support a lot of that complexity, we are getting more and more complex with our systems, and also we're seeing a lot of additional systems being proposed for sites to complete their work. This is an example. This is from SCRS last year, a survey that they completed, showing that sites really feel like there's just too many systems involved. This is stack ranking challenges from a site's perspective, saying, hey, top challenges, we got too many systems going on here. Next to that, repetitive training. So each of those systems often requires training, and I think the majority of us don't just work on one study. So we're doing a lot of repeat training across sponsors and systems. We're doing a lot of duplicate data entry. This is certainly kind of distracting us from patient care, which is really what we want to focus on. And in addition to that, there's not a lot of support from a lot of these technology providers as we're adopting new systems and having questions and learning new systems. It seems like constantly from a site perspective. Additionally, that survey showed that not a lot of sites really feel like the technology that they have available truly meets their needs. So here you can see only 5% are really saying that they're very pleased with the technology that they're utilizing to support their work. And the majority are saying it's only somewhat working, and 32% are saying it's really not working very well. 6% really not happy, dissatisfied with the technology. So this is really showing, man, there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tricia. And as we kind of have done the setup of what's changing across the industry and where are all of the challenges with the technology, we're going to focus in on challenges that she was facing as she thought about how to move to an electronic regulatory system at her site.
Great, thanks, Bree. So when I came in last quarter of last year to take over as the director of research here, I started thinking about the ways I wanted to bring efficiencies and had to take a look at the way we were doing things. But one of the things I wanted to immediately implement was an electronic ISF binder. And coming from the sponsor side, I had used different softwares throughout my career. We starting with very clunky and cumbersome CTMS systems. And then most recently, I had used Viva for some training and SOP reviews that the sponsors would implement. It was their way of keeping track of all of our training. And also some of them were beginning to move to using it for storage for regulatory documents and a few other things. I had not experienced it too much with having it be a CRA tool on the road or anything like that, so I don't have any experience with that. But I knew I wanted to implement an electronic document system specifically for the EISF, and I needed it to be simple and something that my team would adopt readily. there's always a little bit of difficulty with new processes as you begin to implement things. So I demoed several different versions of softwares, some specifically for EISF, and then some which were a part of a larger system so I demoed Compliant, I demoed Real-Time CTMS, and a couple of others. And I just didn't feel like they were the right fit for us, or they were very expensive. So that was kind of the experience I had as I was looking to create an EISF. So then we looked at using SharePoint and the ICH filing system guidelines, but we had problems with permissioning and other things like that. So coming from that place, it was what would work best for us. And so we began to try to drill down to find that solution.
Thanks, Trisha. We're going to transition to our last poll here. And now that Trisha's kind of been talking through where she was at and why she was thinking about adopting an e-regulatory or an ISF, those terms, as you guys might know, are pretty interchangeable, and a lot of sponsors will tell you it's an ISF or an investigator site file, and a lot of sites will also use that terminology, an e-regulatory system. But if you're not using an ISF or an e-regulatory system today, why? Is it just plain too expensive? Is it too complicated? You've got so many fires going on as a site, it just never bubbles to the top of your priority list. Are you also struggling just to see that there's really a need to implement all this change management and there's not really a return of value for all of that work? Or is there another reason that we haven't described here? So if you could just take a quick second here and give us your thoughts. This will be our last poll, I promise, but we really appreciate you guys getting engaged with us. And we'll see here in a second when these answers are in, how the stats have come together, and I'll read that out for us.
I'm closing the poll now. Should take about 15 seconds.
Great. All right. So still working on engagement here, but about 18% of people just said it's too expensive. So that was our top driver. 16% of you guys that answered said there was another reason, and 12% said it was too complicated. And someone felt like there really wasn't a need. So for that person, I'm glad you're on the phone today. Hopefully we can do a good job of explaining to you the purpose behind sort of Trisha's journey. So thank you guys for this. Great information. We're going to move on quickly here and just sort of set the stage. What is an EISF? Why would you might need one? And then we're going to continue on focusing on Trisha's specific journey here. So we know that things are changing from a regulatory perspective, starting with the electronic health record. And those of you that have done this for a while, you usually recognize that clinical research is a little bit behind traditional healthcare with adoption of technology. So the EHR was sort of kicking this off for us, from providing additional funding to support EHR implementation, to requiring it, to seeing in oncology the 21st Century Cures Act happen. The FDA then got on board in 2018 and said, hey guys, when you're submitting to us, it needs to be electronic. We saw international guidelines updated, and then last year heard from the FDA director specifically that we really needed to innovate and adopt new technology. So the regulations are sort of encouraging this change, which is always exciting for us because we want to make sure that we're aligned with regulations. And when you think about an EISF or an e-regulatory system, these are just general components that you should be looking for from a site perspective, right? And you have to sort of keep in mind that vendors are not necessarily an apple to apple comparison. So you certainly should expect Part 11 compliance. Not having this in place can certainly make sponsors nervous. Moving on to workflows and signatures, it might be good to ask the question, is the system smart, right? The way that you finalize and send documents along workflows might look different, document by document. Example, if you're putting source in a system, right, we're all sort of taught source is final. It doesn't need to be up version. You're not going to go back and change it over time. However, you might do versioning of something like an informed consent template before you, internally, before you send it off for approval from your sponsor and then ultimately into the IRB. So that particular document has its own kind of work stream. So can a system support all of these nuances, and can those nuances be customized for you as a site? Remote monitoring, we're going to expand upon in the next slide, so I'll save that there, but certainly something you want to consider, as well as staff profiles. Is this a one and done type of experience, meaning can you add a staff in there, synchronize them across studies, and then as that staff person CV updates, you get instantaneous updated CVs now automatically sent from one click across all of your study binders where that staff person is working on that study. You also want to ask yourself things like, how does your vendor feel about standardizing naming and filing, right? There's different thoughts here, and you guys might know that across the industry, and there are thoughts like, if we really support standardizing naming and filing, can we then automate files that need to go back to our sponsors from our site-facing system? Does it make it easier internally for sites to know across studies now, you really have this reassurance that you're going to be able to always know where to find things like an investigator brochure because it's automatically filed in the same place over and over again. And then moving on to dashboards and analytics. What comes out of the box and what can be sort of configured, and is your workflow complex enough to where you're going to want yourself to on the fly update dashboards and analytics? So these are things to think about across vendors. And then moving specifically on to remote monitoring. I don't know, if now's not the time for us to be thinking about remote monitoring in light of COVID-19, I don't know when is, right? What a compelling event to relook at this. And you really want to know from a vendor perspective, what do they offer here for remote monitoring, right? So specifically, does it go beyond access, right? Are source documents looked at uniquely within the vendor's system? Are they tied to things like an actual patient and maybe even a visit for a patient, where if you're getting hundreds to thousands of source documents in your system, can you easily filter and find them? Things like how familiar are monitors with this system that you've used, or if the monitor's truly going to go in there, and can you work collaboratively in that system together? Can you have conversations in that system back and forth so that you don't have to be emailing back and forth across what's happening as source data verification and source data review are taking place? And can you even get as granular to highlighting on the document itself, the page, the paragraph, the phrase in question, where those conversations are happening on your document? Or really, does it stop at access only, meaning monitors can get in there and get the document, but then all of that cyclical workflow as that document is reviewed and quality controlled and conversations are happening, that all happens outside of the system, as well as then getting that document to a final state of review. So these are things that not all systems are equal on that you want to ask about. And certainly things like reports are helpful to be able to go into a system and see, since the last date my monitor was here or even remotely logged in to look at my documents, what new documents are in my system so that I can easily pull those and show them to my monitor. Other benefits include things like just generally reducing the administrative burden on all of this, right? The system, again, is the system smart, and can it tee up to the next person in line who needs to review that document? Or do you have to wait until you can email someone and say, hey, go in the system and see it's your turn to review and or possibly sign something? Certainly being able to see everything all in one place speeds up study activation, and it increases visibility when you can do things like automatically capture turnaround times across stages in documents and see and share reports, even with someone like your monitor, to know how long are documents sitting in their queue versus your queue before they are finally reviewed. Monitoring costs and the time associated with things like traveling and getting your monitor access to possibly a computer on site, even just as simple as finding them somewhere to sit. How are those things possibly decreased in an electronic system, as well as things like staff changes, right? So we know that, in a perfect world, the same coordinator would work on the same study forever, but that's not reality. So as coordinators turn over, or as coordinators are out of the office and a backup coordinator needs to come in and help with a patient that day or help with a monitor that day, how easy is it going to be for them to get access and then to find files that they need, right? So this kind of goes back to what's the stance on how standardized files are in the system. If everyone is using this like a Dropbox and all of the files are managed differently and named differently, can a backup coordinator really get in there and do what they need quickly if every study looks different in the system? So something to think about. As well as, there's a lot of emphasis right now from our industry on competencies, right? We just don't have the training we need. If we have a system that we can rely on that can really standardize our workflow and standardize how we would file something and the process that we take to finalize documents, we can now train our staff on that and really improve quality across the board with document management. So these are just things to sort of think through as you're thinking about selecting vendors, and things I'm sure Tricia thought about as well along her journey. And now we're going to kind of give her more of a chance to talk about her specific adventure here with implementing an e-regulatory system. So what about tips for choosing the right vendor and system? So Tricia, let us know about your previous approach to solving these challenges prior to having an e-regulatory system in place. What did that look like?
So I am very fortunate to have a director of regulatory compliance who her entire job responsibilities is the regulatory documentation and management of the binders for us here at Keystone. I know that at a lot of sites from monitoring previously that the coordinator, sometimes that's also on your plate for many of you who are coordinators, and that's a huge burden to see patients, manage protocols, and then have to maintain the regulatory startup and ongoing maintenance of regulatory documents. Everyone has this visual of these overflowing binders with so much documentation. You can't flip the pages. You can't really see what's in them. There was something in them. You looked at it previously, and then the next time the monitor comes to visit, it's missing, and you don't know why, and you're scrambling around trying to find the documentation. So I wanted to solve that. I wanted this site, my site, to be different, and that was why I was looking at these EISFs, and then trying to, when I did the early demos, one, they were incredibly expensive, but two, and that's when I started looking at trying to create a DIY concept in SharePoint, and it really just didn't provide all the things that we needed. Much like what you're seeing here on your screen in this slide, talks about the audit trails, the validation, how to permission specifically to a sponsor monitor who comes in, or either remotely or into your site to look at it, so that we are in compliance with all the things that we need to manage in terms of, especially if you're talking about permissioning source documents, we all have to maintain HIPAA and HIPAA compliance, and everything needs to be study specific. So, the DIY system was not working. We actually attempted to do it a little bit. My study coordinators were everyone files differently, everyone thinks differently, not everyone's real linear, including myself. And so that was just a big challenge. So I was continuing to try to find the simple system that provided all of these options that create, including standardized naming conventions and ease of filing, and a system where everyone would be on the same page. So, but as I was demoing different systems, it kept creating more questions for me, and how would that work? And then in full transparency, I'm now trying Viva site solutions, and we're using that currently, and it's really working for us. So
great, Tricia. So let's move to the next question. What should sites consider before they're ready to contact a vendor and get started with the vetting process?
So early on, when I was calling vendors, I really didn't know what I needed to ask. And so, did I want, and the other thing was, what did I want? I looked at some solution was for everything, study management. They had a source document component. They had a EISF component. They had a financial tracking component. And then I started looking at individual vendors, but you don't want to have multiple individual vendors either. They're hard to manage, multiple logins, who needs permission, who doesn't, how many licenses do you need? So I started out kind of at this global level, and then sort of, again, drilled down as I talked to vendors. And the more I talked to vendors, the more questions I had, but I also started to understand kind of what I was looking for. And what I needed was something that brought a lot of value, was either free or reasonably priced, that was usable by my staff, and so ease of use, not a lot of training required, easy to upload, again, sharing across multiple studies and across multiple, your study coordinator, your backup study coordinator, my regulatory affairs person who's managing quality assurance, and myself, to take a look at them and be able to go in and just do kind of quality checks and see where we are with things. And so, it was, my goal was to I knew there wasn't a perfect system out there, but to find the system that met my needs. And so I decided to initially start with the EISF and grow from there, because I also happen to have a pretty fantastic finance and operations person who could give me some reports for other things, like where we were with study startups and finances and such. So EISF was my immediate focus, and then we were going to grow from there. And I felt like that was the best use of technology for my site and to create efficiencies. And, the next thing I would love to have, considering where we are now, is we're saying to monitors, please, if you can at all postpone your visits, please do, to protect our patients and our staff, because we're continuing to see patients. We do have patients that have to continue to come in for different reasons, and would be, being able to provide source review remotely. And we've all done the faxing for database locks, but that's not a very efficient or compliant way to do things. So.
Great, Tricia. All right, so we've talked about sort of looking at a vendor level. Let's talk about what you looked for specifically in a product, in an ISF or e-regulatory product. What were the must-haves, nice-to-have?
Must-haves was, again, I'm just going to keep saying it, and that is the simplicity of the user interface. Basically, I was looking for what was the implementation like? Did we have to, was it kind of some of them are even like kind of do it yourself. You kind of get this broad box, and then you create for your own site how you want it to look. You create your own naming conventions. And that was not something I had time to do or necessarily the want. So implementation was really important. The length of time to adoption, how quickly could I get my team to adopt this, jump on board and understand it, and understand why we were doing it and embrace it as part of our processes. And then, what does it look like in terms of ease of use in sharing it out to get sponsor monitors and maybe even our the contractors that we use for doctors and our techs that might need access. What kind of permissioning and what kind of training would that require for them to actually be able to access certain pieces of it? And, I didn't want just my director of regulatory to be the only one using it. We needed it to be one where everyone could access it, go find the protocol they need immediately, go find those documents they were looking for, but that it was set up in such a way that it wasn't going to disrupt the audit trails and the tracking and all of those kinds of things. So it was it's a big ask, and I realized when we were looking at it that I would find something that looked pretty good, but it didn't fit for for different reasons, and so we were just searching, trying to find the most perfect solution. There are no perfect solutions, but the most perfect solution for us.
Thanks, Tricia. All right, so we talked about what to do before you contact a vendor and what to look at in an actual product. What do you look for in a vendor? So after you started contacting them, was there a certain profile from the actual technology vendor that you were looking for?
Absolutely. I mean, I think support is huge. I mean, we all want to know that once we purchase or adopt a system that, one, we're going to have immediate support as needed to get us up and running. And two, what's the longevity look like? I mean, we know that certain companies, software companies put out new systems, but if they don't have the funding to continue as a business, they may not stay in business. You may get in on a beta stage or what we call a MVP stage, where it's kind of just the minimal viable product. They want to see if people can use it, get feedback, and so you're trying it as a kind of a new user, but you don't want to spend a lot of time using it and creating things that are not going to exist. And so when I was looking at it, I was like, if we upload everything, what's the archiving time like? Do we have to take this down and save it to a different system once the study ends? Is there cost involved in that? How is it, if I was replacing a binder that needs to then be archived and go to storage, what does that process look across the entire electronic version of that? And and then also downtime. And so if we're permissioning, how easy is it for people to come in? So is it web-based software? Is it software that goes onto your own systems, your own servers? And it was really important to me to find something that was web-based, easy to permission. I felt comfortable with the company. I knew of the company. I felt like they had longevity in the industry, something that the sponsors were also adopting and using. Something I had used previously was always good. And, had a little bit of experience with, because I knew it was beginning to be adopted by different pharma companies. And so down the road, would there be an integration that might be possible? And, those were the things that were really important to me. I didn't want to spend a lot of time creating electronic vendor ISFs that would then potentially disappear or no longer be available to me.
All right, Tricia. So let's talk about best practices for implementation. So we kind of talked through how you select the technology you want to use, what vendor profile you need to be looking for. What are best practices and lessons learned during or after implementing a system, right? So now we're fast forwarding and saying, we've implemented a system, we're getting started. What are best practices and things that you've learned now that you've moved forward and you have an e-regulatory solution in place?
Well, I think the biggest piece was, we had this system for a couple of weeks, and we had kind of looked through it. We'd watched the videos. but nothing was getting uploaded into the system. And I kept going and checking and talking to my director of regulatory, who was embracing this as her project. And it just wasn't happening. She was continuing. I was watching her walk around with folders and files to get signatures on logs for training. And I finally said, we have 3 new studies starting. Every single one of them has to go into the new system. Rip the Band-Aid off and go. And don't create, when they send you that binder, just put it aside and start in the electronic form. And she did, and she spent several days uploading for two studies. We had brand new studies starting, which is where we started with new stuff. And it was at the end of the first day, she called me, and we chatted periodically throughout the day, asking some questions. But she said, it wasn't so bad. I actually really like this. This is exciting. I think it's going to be great. And I was like, good. But, you know, it's just the unknown, that fear of the unknown. She's always had her hands on the binders. She's, you know, been here at this particular site for 15 years doing the regulatory in a certain way. And I said, here's what we're going to store, you know, as wet signatures, the 1572, the financial disclosures, any previously signed training logs. But I do want them uploaded, obviously, into the ISF. But I want that in a folder, not a big binder. And I don't print things for the binder. Don't print the protocols. Don't print. And so we did that. And now we're in the process of updating our SOPs so that the sponsors, and sharing with sponsors how we're doing things with that. You know, we're so thankful with the system we're using that there was kind of this, you know, there were already built in the roadmaps of how to do it. You know, naming conventions are there, so you're not trying to create, we're not trying to create the wheel. The training wheels are there for us as we're going forward. And I tell you, the best thing I could hear that day was, this is really cool. It's very exciting. This is going to be awesome. And I was like, that's fantastic. Let's keep going. And so we're actively using it now, and our sponsors have reviewed it. We have for the 2 new studies, and we've gotten great feedback from them, and they're starting to use similar systems. So very excited about that as well.
Great, Tricia. I'm just going to jump in and kind of share and really just emphasize a lot of the points that you've made here. So in my own kind of journey on the site side, when I was recently at Vanderbilt, we transitioned into an e-regulatory system and did it when we were managing hundreds of studies across lots of different therapeutic areas, and completely agree with you that a phase-wise approach, like first you have to rip the Band-Aid, and then you have to know, like, it's not going to be perfect day one, and that's okay. And something that really helped get people on board and get them excited was to really include them in the process, right? So we decided, okay, we're going to have meetings every week where we're going to really focus on the process, and we're going to plan out a reasonable timeline for how we're going to slowly implement, you know, adopting this system over time, right? To your point, kind of starting with new systems is a great way to get started. And you can even think about phasing in things like, you know, initially you don't make PIs go into the system right away and give you electronic signatures. You sort of are loading documents in first, or you might also think about phasing in things like maybe initially the system doesn't include things like source documentation. You're really going to focus on things more like just standard regulatory documents and not think about participant level source. I also think it's great to find things like early adopters within your group, within your community. Know, like you said, you know, it sounds like you were lucky and you had a lot of people that were innovators and sort of early adopters. But when you're trying to do things like this across larger groups, sometimes you need to know who's going to help sort of be the champion and also be in the trenches to really take a temperature check across your staff and be proactive to educate and kind of get ahead of people that are focusing on maybe something negative or really being resistant to change. Having direct, honest, very respectful conversations about areas where people are feeling hindered or, you know, maybe you're just afraid. Education is power, and I think just directly sitting down with those staff and just saying, hey, what are you afraid of? How is this really harder than paper. Oftentimes when we were in situations like that, there would be concerns about things like, okay, do we truly need to capture an electronic signature on this document? We can go into the audit trail and see exactly who provided the information, what time they provided it. So do we also need to have the next step of making somebody sign this form, right? And we would ask things like, well, did they sign the paper? And we would ask things like, okay, if we transition this into an electronic system, right, and we give monitors access to something like source documents, would they also have access to that on site? And what would it look like on site as they're accessing? Did it or did it not contain PHI? And I think what I often found where there were certain personalities that just sort of had this, and I don't think this is just academics, but they sort of took that approach of how do we defend our current position, right? There's been a lot of investment and training that has gone into having processes that exist outside of a purpose-built system. And you have to really, really think hard about, okay, is it really worse to transition? And what are the benefits, process by process, to transition into an electronic system? And I think including your staff in those conversations is incredibly helpful. So just to add there, because I think this is really a key place where people can get stuck as far as, okay, now we've actually implemented, now what? Because it is possible to purchase a system, go through vetting it, and then just not know how to actually get started and create workflows that now really promote adoption of that system. All right. So you guys have hung in there until the end, and I see that there's some questions here, and I am going to kind of send it back over to our monitor here that's looking and taking some of your questions down, and we're going to answer them one by one. I'm going to go ahead and, Jocelyn, it looks like you've asked specifically about FDA audits and electronic regulatory system, and I love this question. So I can say, and Tricia, I don't know if you can chime in on this too, but feel free to, but I know from my own experience, I was audited by the FDA when we had an electronic system in place when I was at Vanderbilt, and I also had experiences being audited when we did not. And my experience was that the auditor kind of sat on the sidelines and sort of side drove with me, right? So the question is, is the FDA allowed to actually log into those systems? So there's no true guidance or regulations, to my understanding, that prevents them from doing that. But my experience was that FDA auditor sat beside me, and we went through the system, and we pulled up our SOPs and our processes, and that auditor took copies of those and really walked through how we were actually using the system. Not very different from how you would look at SOPs and processes where you have paper binders. And that particular auditor told me, that they really liked the transparency that came from electronic systems. I did not have to print out any of my paper that was in that system, but I did sort of side drive along with that auditor, and we shared a screen, and we sort of went through our workflow, and my particular experience was really positive there. So if anyone else has anything to share there, Tricia, if you do, feel free to jump in.
I would just say that I obviously we haven't been using one long enough to we haven't had an FDA audit yet, but in the electronic form. However, part of the reason I wanted to go to the electronic ISF was to ensure compliance with the audit trails and the permissioning that we could accomplish by using some of the systems out there. And so I do think that actually, in general, as the industry is moving this way, both on the sponsor side and the site side, I think that we're going to find that the FDA actually embraces using this, and because it just shows compliance overall, and has some audit trails that don't exist that you have to piece together when you use paper. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents, but I do think it will benefit us down the road.
I agree, and just wanted to interject one additional thing on that point, Tricia, that if you're the type of site that actually has a medical record, right, or you have other types of documents that truly originate electronically, you know, your auditor should know that source is where the information originates, right? And so in similar instances where the documents that I was being audited by in the FDA were not regulatory documents, but were actually source data coming from a medical record, I had the same exact experience where that FDA auditor sat next to me and we sort of drove side by side, looking at the medical record together and pulling up source. I also think it can only help, you know, if you have SOPs where you specifically point back and reference regulations around source and reference that, you know, source is where the information originates. And if that's an electronic system, then it originates in an electronic environment. And that that would be where you would be pointing your auditors and your monitors to in case of an internal or external audit. Great question.
Hey, Bree, I have one other question related to that that might be of interest to others as well, and that is, did you find that it reduced the amount of time on site for the FDA auditor when they used the electronic form?
Absolutely, absolutely. And another thing that it helped do was, you know, full disclosure is I feel like it actually established a good rapport between the auditor and myself. So because the auditor knew that there was a process, I knew where things were, I could explain that process. I was invested and engaged in managing these documents appropriately. I was familiar with how the FDA defined source. I actually think that built our rapport, and I was so much, it was easy for me to click and to search, right? Some of these systems have really great search functionality where you can quickly type in something, pull it up, find that exact document. You know, for example, you're looking for a specific blood pressure on a form, you're looking for a specific, college that a sub-investigator went to, and you can't remember the sub-investigator's name, bam, you can pull their CV up right there. And so I do think that it not only made the process more efficient, but I also think it established a rapport between the auditor and myself that wouldn't necessarily have happened if I would have sat them down with a bunch of paper binders and said, have fun, go figure it out. Right?
Right. Great.
So a couple of additional questions that are kind of coming through that that I can see, and Abby, feel free to kind of jump in as needed, but I see a question here about Viva specifically, which I can answer, and the fact that, which is true, we do have 2 e-regulatory or ISF systems available. One is free. That is the system that Tricia is using and is describing. We also have an enterprise version. You can certainly reach out to us about the differences there, but there's a lot of information on our website if you go to sites.viva.com. And just a general differentiator is that the enterprise version is configurable. We also can integrate it with things like single sign-on across your enterprise if you're managing a whole lot of internal logins. We can do things like integrate it and using APIs with your IRB system or with other in-house systems that you might want to have integrations of data or documents with. And when we talked about things like those workflows and roles, I would say in general, the more complex your site is and the more nuances that you have that really don't fit as kind of like an 80-20 rule, right? Like you have this site and you're a network of sites and you've got a lot of different sites and they all operate differently. And maybe there's regional regulatory coordination somewhere, and then there's central coordination for other groups. When you start to have nuances like that and you need custom workflows, enterprise is likely a better system for you. So kind of general rule of thumb is you're doing different therapeutic areas, a large volume of sites, you've got a lot of different workflow complexities, and you want your regulatory system to talk to other systems, you're probably looking like an enterprise customer. So feel free to go to our website and check in there for more information, and we're certainly available to talk to you about that at Viva more specifically. So, okay, so I think that also answers this integration with an electronic IRB system. So I don't know if Tricia, if you want to talk about integration here and what your thoughts were, about integrating with an IRB system, and can EIRB auto-save approvals, there we go, in the e-regulatory binder product. Did you have any thoughts about integrating with an IRB, Tricia, when you were doing this? And I can also share kind of my thoughts here as well.
I actually did think about that, but it wasn't my primary, one of my primary points of want. But I do think that eventually those are my nice to haves. Would it be great if, you know, we tend to use Alpha IRB a lot for whatever reason. So Alpha could download our new approvals directly into our systems. That would be fantastic. I would love to have that API where we're integrating with sponsors who are using the Viva system at the sponsor level. You know, so, you know, those things, I mean, you can speak to that, whether if those are coming or available and things like that. But, you know, I think integration across the board benefits all of us. Again, it just enhances the audit trail. It shows real-time access. You know, you get a new approved ICF and it has a date on it for the 13th of March, but we didn't actually receive it till the 16th of March. And that's when we had our first new patient sign it. But the auditor says, well, it was approved on the 13th of March. Why didn't the person that came in on the 14th of March sign it? You have to go back and figure out how to show you didn't actually receive it until the 16th of March. This would allow, you know, those kinds of things to not be questions any longer, and we would be able to show compliance. And I think those are kind of some of the benefits of having a connectivity that could benefit all sites.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that here briefly, hopefully, when you're standardizing documents and you have standard naming conventions, you can imagine it's going to be a lot easier for you to integrate with something like an IRB system, especially if you're a larger, more complex sites with different departments, right? If you can work together and adopt standardization, it's going to be so much easier than to send documents not only from the IRB into your system, but also from your site to sponsors, right? And so this just sort of continues to emphasize this need of standardization that we're having. And it's another great thing to think about when you are vetting vendors. Is their API open and publicly available so that you can get somebody with a technology background to look at the two systems you want to integrate and truly make sure they can talk to each other, right? Because it's almost like zipping up systems together, right? If you think about a zipper, both sides have to align. And so you really have to understand both sides of the products that you're looking to integrate. Being able to access something like a public API helps with that. So that was that question. Oh, and this is great follow-up here we've got from Betsy. Thanks for adding that about the FDA recently granting permissions to ask for direct access along with the MHRA. So this question for archiving older studies, allergy partners, I think we might have had some conversations with you guys before. This is another thing where I think, right, you kind of get towards the end of a study and you realize, man, sponsors might want us to keep these things, and depending on your contract and your IRB, for quite a long time. And the reality is that today, e-regulatory and ISS systems are really made for more use in real time. The benefits that you get out of systems like this for reporting, for turnaround times, for automating processes really come from using this in real time and not just looking at documents for storage. You certainly can think about more creative solutions like, do you really need a Part 11 compliant for storage if you're past 2 years from FDA approval process, right? Are you really going to get inspected by the FDA? And so you might want to think about your own internal policies and procedures once you get to archiving and once you're past the ability for the FDA to come in. That might want to be things that you're thinking through, in the contracting process with your sponsors to say, hey, if we have to maintain these things past 2 years, we're not going to maintain them in a Part 11 compliant environment because we're not going to be audited at that point in time, and we need to just zip files up, make them electronic, and get rid of paper. So these are good things to start thinking of on the front end, but the easy answer for not having to put metadata around your documents for reporting and kind of driving processes is that this e-regulatory systems may not be the best to just do massive uploading and archiving of documents in. All right, let's see. Other questions. So how do you get away from wet signatures? This is a great one. Tricia, feel free to back me up on this. But, you know, right, we really talk about the way that you're receiving documents. So as we hopefully can work in our industry to be on more shared platforms, sites and sponsors together, the hope is that more and more things will actually originate electronically, and you can use electronic signatures when needed. Or to go back to that recent conversation or the recent point that I made, you think about the fact that the audit trail shows everything going on in the document, and you ask if a signature is truly needed. Many regulatory systems will allow you to do things like scan paper in and certify the paper as a copy, and the FDA has guidelines for how to do that. So you can then get rid of that paper source and keep that document electronically and put an electronic signature on it. So that might be things to think about there. I'll quickly answer this last question here. Will sponsors eventually mandate the platform? You know, I'm not a sponsor, and I can't tell you. I mean, I think we've been having this conversation a lot where sponsors are offering lots of technology to sites. And I think the ideal environment for sites is that sites own and control their own platform, right? We've definitely thought about that at Viva, where how can we make an environment that everyone can benefit from, but the environment is wrapped around the site's needs if it's owned from the site, right? And so I think those are questions that you're going to have to answer site by site if you would be willing to pass on doing a sponsor study if you're not using their system. And these are certainly current conversations that are going on, but I think we all know as sites, the ideal is that we configure and choose and implement systems that we want, and then we give sponsors access. And then in an ideal world, our documents are actually automating over to sponsors from our own platform. So thank you guys for your time. I know we're at the top of the hour here. I know we're going to do a quick kind of wrap up from SCRS as well. And we will make sure if there are questions that were unanswered, I think there's at least one, that we will reach out and get those questions answered for you. We know there's been a lot going on. This has been a pretty crazy week, and we really appreciate your time and attention. And feel free to connect with us after the webinar if you have follow-up questions.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time today. Good information and filled up the entire hour. Thanks for your presentation. For all the attendees on the line today, don't forget, if you want your contact hours to complete the webinar survey, that will pop up when we close out of WebEx if you want to receive your contact hour credit. I know there's some people that never works, and just send me an email. It's no problem. It happens all the time, and I'll send you the questions and take care of you. For more on good technology, business, and clinical practices and other topics, see the SCRS Insight Journal. We publish that quarterly for members. You can find that in the members section of our website, myscrs.org. Also, check our website out, and you're probably getting emailed from it. And if you're on the forum, you're seeing it a lot, is that we're starting up a complimentary virtual summit series that has all kinds of good information in it, and will open and close with a panel of sites discussing how they're dealing with the coronavirus. I've got some. It's being hosted by a site in Canada, and there's some sites in the United States, and there are 2 sites from Italy that will also be weighing in. And then at the end of the series, in about 6 or 7 weeks, they'll do it again, just see how the progress has gone. So that should be very interesting. Check that out on our website. As I mentioned, that is complimentary for SCRS members and non-members also. Again, we invite you to register for all of our upcoming summits. You can check us out at siteSolutionSummit.com for that information. We appreciate everyone's participation in today's program and look forward to having you join us for more webinars this year. Today's session has been recorded. I will forward the link out to everyone within the next 24 hours. We look forward to your feedback on the closing survey, and thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye, everyone.